afternoon. So I'm going to try and hopefully share my screen with you. Now, Chloe, can you give me a nod if you can see? Oh, fantastic. Chloe, it's almost like we discussed in advance what we were going to talk about. So as Chloe alluded to, I have the privilege of, I guess now speaking relatively frequently to our sector and to colleagues, and sometimes that's really challenging because I know that I'm starting from a position of somewhere between a sense of dubious lack of appreciation or suspicion of the kind of work that we do at the school where I was previously principal. And my kind of pleasure this afternoon is that I know that that's not the case with colleagues at Mead. I know that I'm speaking to you from a point of your own core values, and please understand that I will, if I cover anything that feels really hackneyed to you and known, just please accept my sincere apologies for that, and know that I am totally respectful that I assume I'm speaking to a room of experts in this thinking. So it's only an opportunity for me to retrace things that I'm sure are sentiments that are shared. I'm going to try, and anyone who knows me will know that I'm dreadful at this, but I'm going to try and speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, and that should give us opportunity for questions afterwards, which I'm hoping colleagues at your end will somehow magically manage. And if we have to do it by pigeon in the end, that is also fine. So a little introduction to me. My name is Jenny Thompson. I was previously a SENCo, so that's my background, and I often start by saying that because I think it has sustainedly informed probably even too much of my thinking. I remember when I was doing Future Leaders back in 2013, my feedback was stop being a SENCo in every situation. You've got to learn to be a senior leader, not just have that SENCo mentality. And I said I totally disagree, and because I'm obviously not modeling being able to take feedback, and but I'm really committed to the idea that our commitment to our young people who are potentially our most vulnerable, or at least have indicators of vulnerability within our communities, that is not an afterthought. That is where we begin. And indeed, as Chloe said earlier, I'm also an English teacher, very relieved by the Macbeth question yesterday. I wasn't terribly happy with paper one, and I really love and appreciate teaching. Still, this is the first year where I've not taught, and it's very strange and challenging to move into that space. So I taught right the whole way through while I was principal. 3 years ago now, I moved into an executive principal role. So I was previously principal of Dixons Trinity in Bradford, where before being principal, I'd been head of school. So I joined Dixons Trinity in year 2. I like to think all they did was unpack boxes in year 1, but they tell me they did more than that. And as I said, now I'm executive principal working across all 15 of our schools, but primarily leading on the work of our teaching institute. So really considering the professional development, the coaching and the professional growth of all colleagues. So for my sins, I'm also a behaviour advisor with the DFE, which is a role that I I cherish in many ways, but I also find pretty challenging. I think by nature, I kind of push against authority, and I suppose that's quite an authority to try and push against. And also I've just finished my role as a member of the design team for the social care review, which we haven't had a chance to look at. Definitely do. Big potential for wonderful change led by the inimitable Josh McAllister. So that's a kind of potted history of who I am. I'm obviously, I always say, I obviously can't hide the fact that I am born and raised in Ireland, very, very proud of my heritage, but also think that gives me at times perhaps a healthy remove to be able to look at the system in which we work. So as Chloe said, we're going to really consider this idea of no excuses and what it truly means this afternoon. And really what I want us to the place I want us to begin from is the idea that the excuse being made or what this is pushing against isn't, you know, I used to get asked when I talked about this, things like, what if, so you do same day corrections, you know, irrespective of whatever the situation of the child's, what if an excuse could be? I said, no, you're misunderstanding this kind of conceptually. And I know, of course, that I'm speaking to colleagues who wouldn't at all be in that space. But really what we're thinking about when we're talking about no excuses is not making assertions and assumptions that are limiting based on genericized information about a child, about a community, about a family. Really sincerely being committed to the belief that there is excellence and the potential for excellence in absolutely everyone. And for me, that extends, I think that originally my thinking around that was very pupil focused, very student focused, but over time I've become equitably committed to that within the professional development sphere of colleagues. So if we're thinking this afternoon about, as Chloe said, starting from our most vulnerable. So again, the kind of pushback space of routines driven culture is that that becomes a theatre where the failure to meet those routines becomes exceptionally visible, or the failure to meet those routines or those expectations with no excuses, the misunderstood version of no excuses kind of expectation that if a child does not, then the punishment will be enacted, the sanction will be enacted, is a fundamental misunderstanding of how we construct a routines-driven culture. So a routines-driven culture for us really is designed around our most vulnerable. So we think about who is the child who is going to have the most complex relationship with our school setting. Who is the child who is going to find a corridor the most challenging? Who is the child who's going to find managing their timetable the most challenging? Who is the child who's going to forget their equipment? So we start, and I think this is something that's not made explicit enough across our sector, we start from an appreciation of neuroatypicality. So we start from an appreciation that vulnerability or the social emotional complexities that a young child might bring are not selected, they are not chosen, they are not something that for many of our children with you know, interventions these and commitment this are remediable. You know, we're talking about neurological, for many of our young people, neurological driven condition. And interestingly, you know, I'm obviously again talking to like-minded colleagues, but interestingly, Trinity, the school where I was principal, you know, without question, routines driven, is the SEMH school of choice in our local authority, because the routines are constructed around the most vulnerable, and because our systems enable our most vulnerable to flourish. And the routines create predictability, they create transparency, transparent expectations of the children, transparent expectations on the part of all staff. So that kind of safety and consistency. So really, when we're thinking about having expectations in a routines-driven environment that are expectations for all children, that is the end point. So the end point is that, whatever sanction it may be, every child will have their equipment in all lessons at all times, or every child will have the expectation that they will walk on the left-hand side of the corridor. Whatever it is, the expectation is the end point. It is the piece of theatre that everyone sees at the end. To enable all children and to start from our most vulnerable, the least interesting point to consider is the end point. What we need to consider is everything that we do in advance. So let's say, for example, we're talking about neuroatypicality. We're talking about a child with ADHD. We're talking about a child who is consistently finds it really challenging to consistently bring the correct equipment to class. It's not malice. It's not a lack of effort. It's not a lack of commitment. It is neurological pathways that are fundamentally atypical and different to neurotypicality. So what do we construct around that child so that the end point, the piece of theatre, the classroom where everyone has their equipment, is completely neutral and the same for all children? So the child who would find that the most challenging, the most vulnerable child, what can we put in that is protective up to the point of being in the class with all the correct equipment? So for example, for our young people who may well have ADHD, Bradford is a very, it's a council, a local authority that struggles deeply with diagnoses and even the timely, they don't meet the legal timelines for EHCP referral for I could go into, anyway, I'm sure you are, this is not unfamiliar nationally. So it may well be that this is a young person with a diagnosis, it may well be that it is a young person without. But think about that child. Okay, we would look and say, okay, these are the things that the child is struggling with. What could be the action is, okay, we will not sanction for not bringing a pen because that child finds that really challenging, and there's really valid reasons why that child finds it really challenging. So we will just stop the sanction. I would argue that that is a form of societal exclusion, a form of internal segregation for that young person. And that mentality is what the lifelong consequence of that is the employment figures for our young people with disability. Fundamentally, what we want is to create our schools to be representations of the society we wish we lived in. So what we are looking for is every opportunity to change the input for that young child so that the end point of being in the classroom is completely inclusive, completely accepting. So for example, a really kind of nuts and bolts example, we may well have a mentor for that young person. That child may well meet with that mentor every morning, and that child may well have their locker, and they may well have, for example, we have a room with bigger lockers. So we've got a bigger locker so they can keep more equipment. The locker key is held by the mentor and the child, and the mentor helps the child prepare their equipment every morning, and that's duplicated at break time and it's duplicated at lunchtime, and we are tireless and we are relentless, and we accept that it is Sisyphean, and we accept that for some of our young people, elements of that support can be reduced over time, and elements of learning will take place to enable that child to take on more and more responsibility for those actions themselves over time. We have zero judgment over the fact that for some of our young people, that's not the case. For some of our young people, those neurological pathways are not existing. So it would be an appalling thing to do to not just sustainably give that level of support, so that the child goes to lesson and is able to meet all the expectations. We don't change the expectation, we change the level of scaffolding. that enables the children to get to that point. So that's kind of lovely for those really kind of atypical students within our community. What we would argue is that every child is entitled to enormous amounts of scaffolding and support to enable them to meet expectation. We don't shift the expectation, we shift the level of support. That means, and anyone who's heard me speak before will have heard me say this before, we teach our culture and our expectations as explicitly as we teach the curriculum. Our approach to inclusion isn't ring-fenced to our SEND community. It is conscious of all of the children all of the time, but particularly any of our children some of the time. So it may well be that because of a particular short-term circumstance for a child, they need to lean in to that mentor support or that additionality for a period of time, and they may well transition out of it. And that, in effect, helpfully destigmatizes the whole experience, knowing that we have the high expectations, the routines, helps to surface change for a young person. It makes it explicit and transparent. In a school or in a community where the expectations are not as clear and the sanctions and the routines as transparent and as explicit, change for children and young people can take a long time to surface, or it can be really obfuscated by just the chaos of daily life. Whereas in a very routines-driven environment, what that enables us to do is make visible significant change for our young people, and therefore put in additionality and support to enable them to succeed and continue successfully in our community. I think it's part of it is a kind of slight psychological shift, that yes, we believe in that children need to take responsibility, but that the learning towards that is our responsibility. And a child, any child receiving a correction for any reason in school should not only be a sanction for that young person and something for that young person to take responsibility for and something for that young person to consider and think about and learn from, it also must inherently drive reflection on our part. Is this telling us something? Has something changed? Is this just a coincidence? Or is there something that we need to learn and reflect on from that? And of course, what I'm describing, and I know it's the same for you, is something that is so tireless and so Sisyphean and so exhausting. And when we started out on our journey, nearly 10 years ago now at Trinity, we really lent into this idea of we do whatever it takes. And it was maybe 3 or 4 years in that I edited our headline document to say, as a team, we do whatever it takes, not as individuals, because any of us, just as with the children, any of us can be vulnerable at a point. Any of us can be exhausted, ill, have complexity at home, have complexity within at any point. Therefore, the whatever it takes, the Sisyphean support for our young people must be constructed around a team, not predicated on an individual. So how do we identify the children? Like I said, the kind of wonderful thing about a routines-driven environment is you can see it surfaces super quickly when there is significant change in a young person. However, we also, I've put at the end of the presentation, which I'm definitely not going to get to, but I'll share it with Chloe. I've put all the references that I kind of look to throughout. Some of them are referenced in the slides, some of them aren't, just if anyone's interested in wider reading. So yeah, if so yes, in the routines driven environment, surfaces very quickly, very transparently, visibly, a child who's experiencing significant difference. However, there are also a series of characteristics that we know statistically mean that these children should already be on our radar protectively. We know that is true for our child in need cohort, our SEND cohort, our LAC cohort, our FSM. We know it's true of particular ethnic groups. However, and that's all from the, I'm sure you're very familiar with the Thompson report. However, alongside of that, there are other elements that we need to consider, such as the broader array of protected characteristics, especially in wider national and international picture that is yet to fully embrace, appreciate, and articulate support for all of those protected characteristics. For us as educators, that's not down to our individual politics, that's down to the law. And I can get on my soapbox about that at another point. Alongside of that, I really fundamentally and passionately believe in context and how important context is. There's a lot of discussion around in our sector in education at the moment about sub-optimization. Why are we all planning lessons, duplicating work? Why is there not kind of genericism? And although I appreciate elements of that provide a safe baseline, although I appreciate elements of that potentially offer support to teacher workload concerns or sector workload concerns, I believe that there's a misunderstanding or misappreciation and the potential for a big missed opportunity around being really understanding and really respectful of our context. Knowing our community, knowing our children is a really helpful, protective character, a really helpful way for us to protect our children. So I can give you a kind of really glib, if slightly heart-wrenching example. One of our schools we've got real challenges with attendance, kind of intergenerational, systemic challenges with attendance. And we were seeing these completely unpredictable spikes. But what was interesting was that they were being matched completely by the primary and the secondary, not just sibling groups. We kind of couldn't work it out. And it was only through a deep relationship with our local community that we were able to identify that when fresh deliveries of drugs came into our community, the knock-on effect was late night house parties, late night activity in our community, such that our families, even our families who were just about holding it together, would stop holding it together, and the children weren't in school the next day. So we were able to then start working more coherently with particular kind of key groups in the wider community groups, to start being ahead of that information and start putting in some protective work for our young people to ensure that our children's attendance wasn't being so impacted by really distressing community activity. Okay, so I know some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about now is, I am sure you have this expertise. It wouldn't be right of me not to cover this afternoon. So if we're thinking about those most vulnerable, and we're thinking about the fact that everyone is entitled to this really high level of scaffolding, and we've talked about what that can look like as a kind of scaffolding by design for key individual students, what does that scaffolding look like for all children every day? And these are the kind of, yeah.
really sorry to interrupt. I did just send you a message. I'm not sure. We can't see everything that's on your screen. It might just be me, but I don't know whether you've moved it along. I can only see part of your screen.
Wow, I've not had that particular.
So if you go view slideshow.
Let's have a wee look. Thank you for letting me know, Chloe. That's important.
No, sorry to interrupt.
Try now. How's that looking?
That looks perfect. It may just have been my view button, but that looks perfect.
Oh no, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yes. So, what would this? How would this iterate this idea of scaffolding in every minute of every day for every child? And these 6 examples, these don't come from my thinking originally. This comes from Doug Lamoff's field notes. So it's not from Teach Like a Champion, it's from his really old blog. It's probably about 15 years old now. And it's, again, we've kind of shaped it to meet our need over time. But these are the kind of fundamentals of how we scaffold for our children to enable them to meet high expectations in a routines-driven environment, irrespective of who they are, irrespective of which teacher. These are fundamental structures that help and support any child all the time. So we state the positive. So again, colleagues who were with us before we started the formal kind of part of this afternoon will have heard I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and it turns out that that's excellent parenting advice for tiny toddlers as well. But stating the positive, so it's so easy for us as educators. We are human, we are frustrated, we are tired, you know, all of those things. And this is why we practice. This is why we work together to build the automaticity into our work. So that when we are in that high pressure situation of annoyance, because fundamentally we're human, or whatever, what comes out are these characteristics instead of a kind of manifestation of any frustration. So we state the positive, we say what we want to see, not narrating any behavior that is less desirable. The next one, I think I'm sure there's sort of a PhD in this. I'm not sure what age you get to when you finally work out whether a question is rhetorical or not. I certainly, as an adult, often have no idea. I think it's a really it's a very easy trick to teach, particularly early career teachers, just to absolutely avoid. They often lead to unintended consequences and unintended potential conflict in classrooms, particularly the, you know, what did you just say to me? Or do you really mean, you know, they're just potentially hugely incendiary, even if there's no intention for that. As adults, our role is always to enable a positive response. So our wonderful SENCo, who's now our trust director of Send and Safeguarding, her blog is SENCo 2014. She's wonderful, really visionary, Nicole Dempsey, really great thinker. And her kind of stock line that she always comes back to is, if we are trying to win in an argument with an 11-year-old, are we really winning? You know, we shouldn't be getting into kind of conflict and discussion. Our role is to just enable a positive response. And sometimes that means really changing our own approach to ego. And that can take a lot of work, and it can take a lot of kind of coaching and practice to enable that positive response at all times. Again, similarly, de-escalating situations, and I'll come back to that point about ego, particularly around de-escalating situations. I think it's really important to acknowledge that piece, that it is not about us as individuals, it is about us as a collective of professionals. And sometimes to manage behavior appropriately, the best thing is to step out of a situation and enable a colleague who is confident and willing to step in and circle back to that young person at a different point. Consider tone and facial expression. This can be really hard to kind of work on and coach, and it can take a long time. Because so often it's subconscious, and so often there is no malice at all intended, but that's not necessarily what's being communicated, even to a dispassionate observer. So really thinking about one of my kind of stock examples is the teacher who shouts across the room at the child, "Will you stop talking?" You know, manifesting exactly the behavior that they are trying to correct in the young person, disrupting the lesson, which of course is the reason the young person is being asked to modify their behavior too. So it's, instead of representing the behavior we want to see through tone, through expression, through volume, they are reiterating the behavior they don't want to see. And the last one is this idea of following the routines. And I know this is really central to the work that you do, but I use the example of our wonderful trust SVP, as she is now, previously my vice principal, and before that we were teaching assistants together. Fran is the most wonderful practitioner, and I know that she could, you know, step onto a bus in central London with children who didn't know her, behaving in a way she didn't want to see, and she'd probably generate order, respect, sincerity, and charm in seconds. She's got a wonderful nature and manner, and she absolutely can flourish without routines. Fran and I talked together in a different setting before, and I saw it. You know, she was able to generate that in her own classroom. However, because of that, because she has that extraordinary competence, because she has developed such exceptional practice, for us, she is the most important figurehead of our routines, because she becomes, for the children, the manifestation of those routines being just normal, just the expectation. It's not different, it's not special, they're not for the teachers who need them, they are just for everyone all of the time. And then this little image, I think it's, you know, this is a kind of an easy thing to say and a very difficult thing to change in practice, but it's really thinking about this idea of praise, and praise being like salt or being like sugar, that it's really sparing and really sincere. Praise, well, we know all the data points on this, we know the research on this, that kind of generic praise is often perceived, or is typically perceived by children, as limiting rather than encouraging, whereas children see value in clarity and descriptive and specific descriptive praise. So rather than that, oh, that's great, everyone's got their pens or whatever, you know, kind of mega low baseline. If it's actual specific descriptive praise, specific and relevant to that young person, then it has value. Otherwise, our young people find it diminishing. So this sense of our subconscious selves that we bring to our children, the expectations that we hold for our young people coming through in all that we do, this sense of aspiration for our young people, it's absolutely there in how we talk to our students, and it is most importantly there in how we talk to our students when we are at our most vulnerable, when we are at our point of greatest challenge. If it isn't held as a sincere, if it isn't held in sincerity by us, then in that potential moment of a mask slipping when we are faced with great challenge, it is very hard to row back from that, sometimes with an individual student and sometimes collectively. So building that sincerity and building that practice in how we talk to our students, and being able to do that consistently and at our point of greatest challenge is so important. How we teach our students, one of the kind of most powerful examples I've seen is the idea that we heavily scaffold our most vulnerable learners. We ensure that everything is stepped out, and our perception is that our most capable young people can have this autonomous, independent space. At Trinity, that's not how we work. We work with the idea that rigor and scaffold is equitably respectful for all. So how we teach students, our expectations, and our willingness to commit to every child is an unspoken characteristic of reinforcing our sense of aspirational identity. The relentlessness with which we approach student learning, or indeed how we support students to perceive their own learning, behaviour, as we've discussed, and of course, ultimately, in student achievement and progress. But all of the kind of research that sits around this, and this is a summary from Robertson's report in 2016, and what's wonderful about this report and kind of unique about this report is that it's cross-sectional from nursery-aged children to university students, and the kind of consistency of the feedback is you know, almost humorous. What children want is absolutely that sense of consistency, absolutely the perception that their teacher will honour and respect them and not seek to embarrass them, that you know, that we are in that routines driven space, therefore we are able to bring our true selves to the classroom. There's a kind of a false equation in the kind of edu-Twitter world of educational thinking, that routines driven creates automaton teaching, or kind of mechanical teaching. And our lived experience is that it is the very opposite of that, that routines and expectations creating consistency and safety for the child also creates consistency and safety for the practitioner, such that we are able to bring our true selves, we are able to bring our true personalities. I think there's an extraordinary piece around teacher well-being in knowing that you can be your sincere and genuine self in your classroom. There's just something that takes away our sector-wide exhaustion about that. Now, kind of the piece that we haven't talked about in this is, we've talked about it in relation to those very specific children who, whether longitudinally or momentarily, have need for exceptional support. We've talked about the kind of consistency of global support for our young people. We've talked about the sort of nature of routines driven consistency and automaticity in our practice as educators. But the piece that's kind of outside of that, we did touch upon it a little bit in the example I gave around attendance, is this idea of our role in schools as civic institutions. And the wonderful Leora, who is leads the CST and is just a brilliant visionary. You know, her perception is that school trusts are the new civic structures of our communities, and in communities where so many of those typically historical anchor institutions are either becoming peripheral or have had very challenging and changing experiences in the last decade, such that their relationship with the community is really different. And really thinking about our role in schools as anchor institutions, and our link therefore to our families and to our communities. And the EEF have a wonderful and kind of not made hugely visible piece of work on this around working with families. I don't know whether it's something that has become somehow superseded by the kind of world of the pandemic, but I think it's something that certainly as a trust we are deeply leaning into and really considering our civic responsibility. But these are some of the kind of key points in relation to parental engagement. And the first one for me is so consistent with how we approach our young people, how we approach each other as colleagues, how we approach our wider community. This absolute commitment to optimism, this absolute commitment to a sense of aspirational relationship to our children, to our families, to our colleagues. That we accept when there is challenge, that is our job, that is the work that we intend to do. It is the work we want to do, and we will not be the partner that steps away because it is difficult. We will be the consistency, and we accept the sustained effort and support, just like we do for our children, so we will for our communities. And I think the kind of lack of coordinated understanding of how to do this work across our sector is really tangible, and the ability to reach our families is of equitable challenge with our children. So when we're considering our role as anchor institutions, or our role in terms of civic responsibility, we need to start from our most vulnerable. So for very basic things, like if we're trying to communicate to all of our families, think about who are those people who are so hard to reach, and start with them and make the offer for all, the offer of typicality, and the offer that would indeed reach those people. And if there isn't the expertise to be able to do that, reach out and seek that expertise elsewhere, because the evidence is suggesting that so few schools and so few trusts and so few civic institutions beyond education have got confidence in their specialism and ability to do that. So the kind of great piece is that there is huge evidence now that says, how do we get this right? How do we get our relationship with our community right? How do we get our relationships with our children right? How do we build a space that is exceptional and delivering of progress for children, an exceptional place for colleagues to grow in their career, but also being able to have lives beyond school and be able to perceive the role. I absolutely believe the education and civil rights movement of our generation. I do not believe that we need to sacrifice ourselves as part of that. And we know now, and I think it's really positive that we know that it is about coherence. And of course, I know that I'm talking to people who have already lent heavily into this work. Coherence of vision, coherence of strategy, and knowing that operations are such that they are never going to impede. It's that piece of make operations so easy that they don't even need to be on the table. Nothing should take away from the effort that a teacher is going to put into the learning for the child. And of course, through true coherence of vision, it means that the further decision is taken from that initial vision. So it's, early career teacher, it is perhaps someone newly joined, it is whatever, however many iterations away from the original vision. If that is truly clear and truly coherent across the organization, the decision taken at any point by any one individual doesn't need to be micromanaged, because it will be coherent with the original vision. So it's all about pushing power down, really respectful structures, and really respectful of individual competence. So in a way, it is out of the consistency, out of the coherence, and out of the alignment that true autonomy can be experienced. So in summary, we're talking about being really appreciative of context, really knowing the underlying problems, community-wide, family-wide, individual. Be really preemptive and proactive. We know who the children are, and we can scaffold up to the point of meeting expectations rather than changing expectations from the point of not meeting them. Index of multiple vulnerabilities, I haven't necessarily talked about explicitly, and although I know colleagues here will already be familiar with this term, knowing that any of those individual complexities, vulnerabilities, or protected characteristics that we already looked at, we know where the intersectionality is for our individual young people. Managing the moment, so that's where we looked at those kind of series of strategies that aren't about kind of wider strategic approach to a young person. It's about when something happens in the moment, we will still continue to iterate, and no excuses, high expectations, and that's that automaticity that will get us through those moments of vulnerability, those moments of frustration, comes through practice, which is of course the staff training and the consistency. The multidisciplinary team, I will just talk, I'll just touch on, because I appreciate we've got very, very little time left. That our multidisciplinary approach at Trinity was really born of a struggling local authority, a failing local authority. And we were not willing to accept that our children couldn't get the support that they explicitly needed, because CAMS was overwhelmed in our authority, or there were no EPs available, or social care was wildly inconsistent. And I say all of that when being deeply respectful of social care, being deeply respectful of educational psychology, and being deeply respectful of CAMS, because I couldn't run a school if my budget was stripped to the extent that I could only have 2 teachers for 600 children, which is the circumstance that we find ourselves in Bradford with our wider multidisciplinary work. So what we did was took our responsibility as an anchor institution seriously and brought that team in-house. So we have our own child psychotherapist in-house. We have in our trust our own social workers, and we have our own educational psychology that we can draw down. What isn't available within our local authority, we have made available within our own trust. And of course, fundamentally, and this is the kind of positive and wonderful piece, is that we work collaboratively. We know that the strongest indicator of individual school competence is often their willingness to work and to share more widely. And just before I finish, I want to kind of round out on a really important, I think, a really important point that can get lost or can become horribly peripheral in this work, which is the idea of the diversity bonus, and really appreciating the full breadth of diversity and the full breadth of protected characteristics and those contextual characteristics that sit beyond protected characteristics. And really understanding that to be able to be a true anchor institution, to be able to have full appreciation of all of our children, all of our staff team, and all of our community, we need to be wholly diverse and intentionally representative. So we now have the overwhelming evidence that shows that intentionally constructed diversity generates team thinking that is able to manage complexity, manage problem solving, support motivation, support innovation, and create ever more accurate predictions. And of course, in our context, reach those areas of community, those areas of complexity and vulnerability that homogeneity would never allow us to get to. So I think I've put most of, if not all of, the references on the slides, and I'll ensure that hopefully Chloe can get them to you. It's my pleasure to take any questions. If I can be of any use this afternoon, I will stop sharing, because I don't think anyone just wants to look at some footnotes. Thank you. And I don't know how you want to coordinate any questions that might emerge.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I have had a few questions come through by direct message to me, and then I've also got a couple, so I will hijack the Q&A with those as well. And then if anyone has any more that then haven't been answered, they can do that however they wish, either through to me on the chat or just the old-fashioned way, turn the camera off and give us a wave. But if I get straight in, so first question that came through to me was, how do you make sure that all staff follow the same no excuses approach, right through teaching staff, pastoral staff, support staff, etc.?
Yeah. So I think that the truth is, historically, I don't think we were great at this. I think we were pretty good at getting it right for our staff who had responsibility for directly educating our children, not necessarily the wider piece. However, we took the decision to jettison our old approach to performance management, and instead we have extended our approach to professional growth. So coaching, committed instructional coaching for all educational staff, and we've now extended that across. So our associate staff are no longer in a kind of deficit place. Our associate staff are treated absolutely equitably with our educational team, and all staff within Dixons now have instructional coaching.
Would you mind just, I'm adding this to answer the question, but what does that look like for, you mean by that non-teaching staff? What does instructional coaching look like? That's really interesting.
Yeah, I appreciate that's a total grenade to throw in at this point in a conversation. And what I will say is I've tried really hard this afternoon, because I kind of wanted to honour what the conversation I'd had with Chloe. I've tried really hard to not just give you kind of pre-existing presentation that I can kind of roll up. I've tried really hard to make sure that this was kind of special and different for you. However, therefore, if there's kind of any avenues that you would like to explore further, I'd really encourage you to look at I mean, I wish I didn't have to say our YouTube channel, but our YouTube channel, which is Dixons Open Source. Because in the episodes on Dixons Open Source, we explore kind of each of these potential grenades really deeply, but really superficially. I will tell you that what that means is it's typically once every 2 weeks. Some schools it's 30 minutes, some schools a little bit longer, some schools a little bit shorter, depending. Typically it's your line manager who's your coach, not always, depends on the size of the team, depends on the expertise. The kind of, what we say is that the functional lead and the principal will ensure it's a highly effective coach. So some of those decisions can be pretty nuanced. For example, in one of our schools, it would mean the site manager would be coaching his son-in-law, which I don't think is healthy in any way. So sometimes it's not your line manager. But that kind of instructional coaching model, then it means we have the opportunity to have some kind of more generic inputs around how do you, all of our staff will interact with children. So how do you do that in a way that is consistent with the teaching team? How do you do it in a way that means that the children don't have a perception that there's somehow a hierarchy at play or a difference at play? But that, to be fair, that element is only an element of the coaching. It would be a completely kind of disrespectful approach to our associate colleagues to provide instructional coaching exclusively on kind of managing children, families. You know, they also have really kind of specific to role and specific to their own individual professional growth.
Thank you. I appreciate it's a hard question to answer in just a couple of minutes, and appreciate also what you said about making today's session really kind of special to us and what we spoke about before. But that said, yeah, we'll definitely be seeking out some of the stuff on open source around that, because one of the things at Castlemead at the moment we're really looking at is our professional growth offer for all staff. At the minute, I think there is a disparity between our offer for teaching staff compared to support staff. So we want to look at how we can enhance that curriculum. So that's, yeah.
Well, I think there are a number of episodes on our new approach to professional growth.
Wonderful. I look forward to tuning into those. I'm just scrolling through my questions. I suppose linked to that one, there's a question around how you, and you perhaps touched on this, but I didn't know if there's anything you want to add in terms of making sure, you mentioned like practice for your practice. Yeah. So what does practice look like for staff at Dixons?
So we have our intentional operating model at Dixons is aligned autonomy. So there are elements that we agree are an expectation and a consistency across all 15 of our schools. How they are iterated in each school is really specific to context. It's really respectful of context, really respectful of where a school may be at on its academy transformation. So the kind of expectation is that practice and coaching take place. We've got some parameters around frequency and consistency. And however, if I'm going to kind of give you a sincere mapped example, I'll just talk about Trinity, which is the school where I was principal for years. So at Trinity, we have practice 3 mornings a week, where as a staff team, we all meet together before the year has begun. Our SLT will have mapped out what we want to do across those sessions and kind of what we're leaning into for that academic year, or what we know we need to work on, we know we need to enhance. Typically, that would be maybe 3 strategies, maybe 4 across an academic year. So it's really about the rigor of routine, the rigor of practice. However, we are absolutely unafraid to totally drop down from that kind of mapped program to enable us to be highly responsive. So let's say year 11, this isn't the kind of burning experience of the last couple of weeks, but let's say year 11 totally start to prat around. Hello GCSEs, then we may well choose to drop whatever we had planned for that practice in that period of time, and really focus in on how we talk to our children when they are in a space, a kind of intellectual space that's got much more pressure attached to it, so that we can do that really consistently, so that we can put in that kind of scaffolding of support to kind of create that global de-escalation for year 11, rather than wait for the tipping point of whatever is going to occur.
Lovely, thank you. I'm now combining a couple, but yeah, because there's a little bit of duplication, but you talked so much about the scaffolding that goes into ensuring that all students can reach that end point, the theatre, as you referred to it as. There will be instances where those routines or expectations are not met. Yeah. What are the sanctions that you put in place in those instances?
Well, the sanction will of course be relative to whatever has occurred, but let's assume it's whatever one of the learning habits hasn't been adhered to, 30-minute same day correction. If a sanction is infringed twice in a single academic day, then that becomes an R. However, what I will say is that almost never happens, because the conversation that's stimulated from the initial correction should be a protective piece and should have the intention of creating protection. If anything escalated beyond that, then we have what's called red line. And again, our schools have autonomy to iterate that differently in their different settings. The wonderful thing about the euphemism of red line is it kind of means nothing. So it means that it can be really nuanced to meet the context of an individual child. So for example, typically it would mean we don't have at Trinity, intentionally, we don't have an isolation room. We don't have like, you know, I've already said I'm an ex-SENCo. You can take me so far from it. So typically what that would mean, again, I'm totally respectful of the fact that we're a very small school, so there's some luxuries that we get from that. You know, you've got 600 kids, that changes some of your maps that you can put in place. But typically it would mean that a child would come and sit in my office for the day, hellish as that experience is for the kids, and they would complete academic work. But the most important things were the conversations that go on alongside of it. Any child who was in a red line will not go back into lesson without meeting with their caregivers. And that's where the piece around being able to reach your most vulnerable families is as important as the piece around being able to meet your most vulnerable children. You know, before all of this, I was a preschool teacher, and you know, give me the 3-year-old with the crayons, or, you know, whatever we need to do for that meeting to take place. If I need to go and sit in a living room, if I need to go bang on a door, if I need to be really appreciative and understanding that, and again, we know this, that it's out of the most innocuous situations that you can sometimes find out what the real kind of concern, what the real problem is. You know, if it's auntie's just given birth, so mum is supporting auntie loads, and mum is the backbone of the family, and suddenly that backbone and support isn't there, and teenage boy has gone to pieces without his mum packing his PE kit, you know, or whatever it is. So I would say it's our structures are important, the consistency is important, but the most important piece is the listening and the learning, and the willingness to invest in the time of those conversations that sit alongside it.
That response is a really nice way to sum up the whole presentation, actually, so thank you. Probably scroll my way through our CMA questions. I don't know if any other colleagues viewing have any questions that they would like to share. Perhaps we feel they've all been answered. Jenny, I can't thank you enough. Honestly, it's been a joy to listen to you speak again. I feel lucky enough to do so, but it's just been so hugely beneficial to hear you talk about, as you described earlier, your lived experience, and the fact that at Castlemead, you know, we talked before about the fact that we're a growing school, we're in our 3rd year, about to go into our 1st year of GCSE. So some of the things you've talked to us in terms of that growth and how you sustain that culture and that routines driven culture, and ultimately to be able to talk us through the benefits that brings to all stakeholders, first and foremost the young people that we serve, but also their families. And I think that section on families and making the school easy to reach for those so-called difficult to reach families is something that's really stuck with me, I think. So thank you so much. And we will, I'm sure, definitely all be tuning into your open source videos.
Just be mindful that they were filmed across 2 pregnancies for me. So it's like, I just can't look at them. There's, you know, this is it. We've got to get rid of our ego, me included. So I'll look at the heavily pregnant videos. Anyway, it's an absolute pleasure, and just really respectful that at the back end of an academic year, people are still willing to pursue this kind of thinking. It's really lovely.
Well, we're so grateful to you for giving over your time. So thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you.
Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.
Bye.